All right, let's get into it. Today, we're tackling a really tough question in social science. What happens when the hunt for truth puts actual people at risk? Yeah, we are stepping right into the ethical minefield of sociological research.
And it all really boils down to this. To get to the real, raw, unvarnished truth about how our society actually works, how far are we willing to go? Where do we draw that line?
This leads us straight to the fundamental tension, the real dilemma at the heart of the entire discipline. It's this constant, tricky balancing act that every single researcher has to deal with.
So on one hand, you've got to strive for validity. That's the need for authentic, unfiltered data to see the world as it really is. But on the other hand, you've got ethics, the absolute, non-negotiable duty to protect the people you're studying from any kind of harm. And these two powerful goals, well, they are often in direct conflict.
So what happens when that balance just completely breaks down? Let's dive into some of the most infamous cases in sociology. We're talking studies where the chase for data led researchers to cross some pretty unforgivable ethical lines.
And a perfect, or maybe I should say infamous example, is Loud Humphrey's tea room trade. I mean, even today, decades later, it is still one of the most controversial studies ever done in sociology, and for a very, very good reason.
Here's how Humphreys did it, and it unfolds in 3 pretty shocking steps. First, he pretended to be a lookout so he could covertly watch anonymous sexual encounters between men in public bathrooms. Okay, then. Second, he secretly wrote down their license plate numbers so he could track down where they lived. And then third, a year later, he showed up at their houses in a disguise and interviewed them, pretending he was doing a public health survey.
The ethical violations here are just staggering. There was zero informed consent. The deception was, well, off the charts. It was a massive invasion of privacy. But most importantly, the potential for harm was catastrophic. See, at the time, homosexuality was illegal. His data could have literally destroyed lives, leading to arrests, blackmail, and public ruin. It's studies exactly like this that forced the creation of the strict ethical codes and review boards we have today to make sure nothing like it could ever happen again.
So you have to ask, right? Humphrey's work did challenge some harmful stereotypes, but did the ends justify the means? The consensus today is a hard no. This study has become the go-to cautionary tale, the textbook example of exactly what not to do.
And look, Humphreys wasn't alone in this. In the 70s, you had James Patrick go undercover with a violent gang in Glasgow, putting himself and, others at huge risk without anyone's consent. A decade before that, John Howard Griffin used medication to darken his skin to experience racism firsthand, which meant he was deceiving literally everyone he met. In both situations, the insights they got were powerful, for sure, but the ethical price tag was just incredibly high.
But not all cases are so black and white. And that brings us to the gray areas. These really complex situations where figuring out the right thing to do is much, much harder.
A great example is Sudhir Venkatesh's famous study, Gang Leader for a Day. Now, unlike Humphreys, he was overt. The gang knew he was a researcher. The thing is, over 7 years of being embedded with them, those lines got really, really blurry. Was he just an observer anymore, or was he starting to participate? It raises all these serious questions about his objectivity, maybe even his complicity in what they were doing.
And this puts researchers in a classic moral bind. I mean, think about it. When Maurice Punch secretly studied police officers, he saw racism and brutality up close. If he reported it, he'd be breaking confidentiality, and his research would be over. But if he protected his sources, he'd be staying silent about injustice. There's just no easy answer there.
And then you have his whole other issue of representation. In his classic study of working-class boys, Paul Willis nicknamed them the lads. And his work was groundbreaking, no doubt. But you have to wonder, did those boys really, truly get how their words and actions might end up reinforcing stereotypes or how it could affect their futures? It just goes to show you the real power imbalance between the person doing the research and the people being researched. So, wow. With all these problems, you might be asking, is it even possible to study sensitive topics ethically? Well, thankfully, the answer is yes. But it requires a totally different approach, a real fundamental shift in how we think about it. And a key example of this shift is something called feminist methodology. Now, this isn't just a list of rules, it's a whole philosophy. It's about actively putting the welfare, the empathy, and the dignity of the participants, especially if they're vulnerable, at the absolute center of everything you do.
Dobash and Dobash used this philosophy so powerfully in their landmark study on domestic violence. They did overt, incredibly sensitive interviews with women in shelters. And their number one priority wasn't just getting data, it was building trust, creating a safe, empathetic space. Their work became this amazing blueprint, proving that you can get profound, valid insights, not just without sacrificing ethics, but that an ethical approach often makes the research even better.
So after going through all these different cases, where does that leave us? What is the real price of truth?
When you look at these studies side by side, you can really see a spectrum. You start with the outright deception and potential for harm in Humphrey's work. Then you move into the messy, blurred boundaries that Venkatesh had to navigate. And you end up with the human-centered approach of Dobash and Dobash, who put welfare above everything else. Each one of these cases really forces us to weigh the value of knowledge against the fundamental cost to human dignity.
Ultimately, I think the lesson is this. Ethical research isn't about finding some perfect, easy formula. It's a constant tightrope walk. It's about always navigating that tension between gaining insight and preventing harm, between getting access and making sure you have real informed consent.
And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. In our search for knowledge, what is the one line that we all agree should never, ever be crossed? As we keep trying to understand our world more deeply, figuring out exactly where that line is, well, that remains one of our most important challenges.